When we look back at the American Revolution, we have seen that there were a couple of things that led to the beginnings, if you will, of a national identity and a communion, if you will, between the various and sundry colonies, later, of course, to become states. One of the events that prompted this was, if you remember, the Great Awakening, and then, of course, the 7-Year War, of course, as known in the colonies as the French and Indian War. This started to produce a national identity because people shared in a common experience. And that led to, years later, of course, the American Revolution. And then, of course, the revolution itself helped, again, promote this idea of a national identity, that there was such a thing as an America and Americans. But we were still a step away from being removed, if you will, from state identity and having that national identity. That would change with the coming of the War of 1812. America at war. It is a gruesome thing to go to war. It is a destructive thing, but at times things can be built from it. And in this case, as was often referred to, this was referred to as the Second American Revolution. Finally, independence on many levels from Great Britain. How this came about, what the war was like, that's what we're going to take a look at.
To those who can hear it, the sound means death. America is on the brink of annihilation. An invading army is at the doorstep of one of the country's largest cities. Its capital has been ravaged, its defenses shattered. Only one thing stands between the enemy force and the nation's destruction. The will of 15,000 men and women determined to defeat America's first invasion.
This was a war, when it started, we thought would be extremely easy. It is a war that is fraught with contradictions. You have some of the biggest battles early in the war ending in an unbelievable fashion. The biggest surrender of an American army of somewhere in the neighborhood between 4,000 to 6,000 to just 800 attackers takes place when a cannonball goes through their kitchen, depriving them of hot food. Another invading army going into Canada from New York gets across the river and realizes that it left its ammunition on the other side. The biggest battle of the war, and surely the most important, and one of the great victories in American history, takes place after the war is over and the peace treaty had been signed, ending the war. And in between are all these contradictions, but the ultimate result will be finally an independent America. How this came about, what the causes of the war were, and the background, that is what we're going to take a look at. Hello. I'm sorry, I can't talk right now. Okay, I'm giving a lecture in my online class. I'll talk to you later. Please pardon the interruption. The single biggest cause of the war was problems on the high seas. You'll see the engraving that takes place, and the word in red, impressment. This was a common tactic with the British Navy through most of their early wars. The British Navy, considered militarily to be the best, was also one of the worst to serve in. In order to get quote unquote volunteers for the Navy, many of them had to be kidnapped. They were literally hijacked. Press gangs roamed the docks at night, knocking people up. And when those men came to, they found themselves now permanent fixtures in the British Navy. Things were so bad that the Navy, when they landed at home port, could not let the sailors off because they knew they wouldn't come back. Women who were married to those sailors had to come on board. Canvas shrouds were stretched between cannons, and that was their onboard condo, if you will. The term son of a gun comes from births that took place in those quarters. So that was the British Navy. When their wars with Napoleonic France commenced, they were short on the number of sailors they needed to man all their vessels, and so impressment began anew. They stopped American ships all over the place. One of the most famous would be the seizing of a ship called the Chesapeake, which we'll talk about later. The Chesapeake was an American naval vessel. It was part of our military. This was not a merchantman. She was out on her shakedown cruise in the Chesapeake Bay itself, which is in American waters, when, as you can read there, the British ship Leopard stopped it, claiming that there were British naval deserters on board. Now, were there? Yeah, there were. But the 4 men that they seized, 3 of them American citizens, right, and 2 of them happened to be African Americans, were not deserters. That leads to a side note. When you talk about integration of the armed forces, America's Navy, and I mentioned that when we talked about the Revolutionary War, was much more in keeping with what we're used to, integration of the armed forces, than the Army was, for a number of reasons, which we'll discuss later. But be that as it may, those 4 men were hauled aboard the British vessel that had fired on the American ship, killing a couple of individuals. Later on, a British vessel literally entered New York Harbor and lob a cannonball and decapitate a man by the name of John Pierce. Pierce had his head taken off. There were no deserters aboard that ship. So it was these insults, these warlike actions taken by the British, which was pushing America closer and closer to war. As these things happened, there were other incidents that took place which quickened the pace towards war. The British and French decrees. These were issued as these 2 countries were at war with one another by each of the ruling class, stating that any ship sailing to ports in their enemies' homes would be taken and all the goods would be confiscated, and the ships taken, and the sailors again be forced to serve in that nation's navy. This, of course, was the lifeblood, particularly of New England. This commerce was extremely important to our economic well-being, and this was being stomped on by both sides. In response to this, Thomas Jefferson decided to issue an embargo. We would not trade with anybody, not just the British and the French. We would not trade with any nation. Our ports along the East Coast became giant parking lots. The idea behind it, of course, would be that other countries would put pressure upon these 2 to lift their decrees and allow trade. Well, that didn't happen. We are going to enter a severe economic downturn. And after the Chesapeake Leopard affair, Jefferson passed the Embargo Act of 1807. So the Chesapeake Leopard affair, combined with the decrees, is going to push Jefferson's hand. That is going to be replaced in 1808 by the Non-Intercourse Act. This act lifted the total embargo, and instead, we would just not trade with the British and the French. But of course, 90% of our trade was with those two countries anyway. And keep in mind, when you're talking about trade, you're not talking about strictly going to England or to France. Many of their islands in the West Indies, British and French West India Islands, were prime targets for our traders.
When James Madison took over as president in 1809, the United States was in the grip of a 2-year economic downturn created by self-imposed restrictions on trade that forbade American ships from sailing to foreign ports. These restrictions were contained in the Embargo Act of 1807, a law that was intended to punish foreign nations, especially France and Great Britain, for not respecting America's shipping rights by searching U.S. ships, seizing cargo, and forcing American sailors to work for them against their will. This graph, depicting changes in U.S. exports from 1805 to 1812, clearly shows what happened as a result of U.S. trade restrictions. In 1806, American exports were $110 million. But after the passage of the Embargo Act in 1807, exports fell dramatically to only $20 million. Illegal smuggling in 1808 caused exports to increase to about $50 million, but this was still less than half the level of 2 years before. Right after taking office, President Madison acted to loosen the restrictions on trade, restrictions that had caused American ships to sit idle and U.S. goods to pile up in warehouses. So, still hoping to force France and Britain into ending their interference, a new law was enacted that permitted American ships to trade with all foreign nations except for these two. Unfortunately, the new law, called the Non-Intercourse Act, was no more successful at halting British and French interference with American shipping than the Embargo Act had been. Not only that, under the new law, U.S. exports failed to increase, and the nation's economy continued to suffer.
So we were still at the mercy, particularly of England, as far as our trade and economic well-being go. Well, Madison decided to pursue another tact. And this would be called Macon's Bill number 2. And don't ask me, I have no idea what Macon's Bill number 1 was. Anyway, Macon's Bill number 2 was an attempt to act rather slyly, if you will. In effect, it was a bribe aimed at whatever nation would take advantage of it first. And what it said was simply this: the first country that would start trading with us by repealing their trade restrictions, then we would automatically not trade with the other country. Well, when you really looked at this, we in effect were becoming an ally of France. France really did not have enough ships to effectively stop us from a total embargo of Great Britain. So Napoleon said, well, good. Why should I waste my navy when America will do it for us? So Napoleon lifts his restrictions on American trade, which basically do nothing because the British are going to stop our trade anyway. So in effect, we become an indirect ally of France. and aim all of our rancor at, of course, Great Britain. On another front, you have the arrival of the war hawks, people who are pushing us closer and closer to war. One of the leaders of that group was that man, who by the artist's conception there looks like he should be the MC for a late night horror movie show. But this is, of course, Henry Clay, who would later be known as the Great Compromiser. But he was not going to compromise on war. He was one of the new faces in Congress. No connection to the American Revolution, not one of the founding fathers. He and others like him were simply known as the boys, the young'uns who had come into Congress, replacing those that had faced the struggles of the American Revolution. They got a little bit tired of the old timers constantly touting the Revolutionary War credentials, and they like to have some of their own. Clay and another gentleman by the name of John C. Calhoun were prominent among these war hawks. Again, they are a new breed, not just because of their youth, but where they come from. At the time, Kentucky, Tennessee were considered the West, and these Westerners were flexing their muscles. And in particular, they wanted to get rid of Indian resistance because the West was founded upon expansion fever that had gripped the continent since the time the first settlers landed in the 1600s and was only being added to as we increased our land holdings, oftentimes at the expense of the Native Americans. And of course, there would be reaction on numerous fronts, but the most dangerous was the one there led by Tecumseh, a Shawnee chief in the Indiana-Illinois territory. Tecumseh and his brother, the Prophet, would put together a federation, the likes of which had been unknown since the Iroquois Confederacy. And their sole purpose from this Indian Superman would be to stop the expansion of the Americans. Tecumseh was getting the support of the British, particularly from their forts that had been set up and not removed from the West. Now, Tecumseh had participated as a warrior in the revolt, if you will, by Little Turtle in the 1790s. The most crushing defeat in American history until Custer's Last Stand, defeat by Indians, took place in the 1790s. Eventually, George Washington, as president, as we already know, will send out another army led by General Mad Anthony Wayne, and that will put an end to that particular rebellion. But inspired by it, educated by it, Tecumseh is now going to lead his Indians in an all-out effort, spreading from the upper Midwest in Michigan and Wisconsin all the way down to Florida. Tecumseh's alliance was again formed to stop the westward push of America by forming a confederacy of all Indians east of the Mississippi. It became almost a religious messianic movement. The prophet, as he was called, predicted that the moon would blot out the sun. And of course, that was because Tecumseh had told him upon reading Poor Richard's Almanac, of course, done by Ben Franklin, that a total eclipse was coming. And that eclipse, predicted by Tecumseh and, of course, his brother, the prophet, gave them power among the Indians who thought they controlled the sun and the moon. Tecumseh's enemy in all of this was a gentleman by the name of William Henry Harrison.
Perhaps Tecumseh is joking. He knows very well that treaties lawfully made can never be rescinded. What we ask now is simple, that you cease your efforts to organize the tribes against us, and that you join us in making one last agreement, giving us title to the land.
One last agreement? Every treaty you have ever made with the Red Man since coming upon this land, you promised was to be the last. And each time you invaded us again. You ask us to have confidence in your promises. When Jesus Christ came upon the earth, you killed him, the son of your own God. And only after he was dead did you worship him and start killing those who would not. Who could trust the word of such people?
Tecumseh is wrong, most of all about our treaties. We have dealt fairly and justly with the Indian people, and the fact is, this was always Miami land until the Shawnee invaded them and stole it.
This man is a liar!
I see no way to continue. This council is adjourned. Let us all retire peaceably.
Eventually, the feelings between those two would result in an all-out war, a war that Tecumseh was not prepared to push for at that time. He wanted to solidify his hold on the southern Indians, so he left their place on the Tippecanoe River called Prophet Town. He left it under the control of his brother and told him to avoid any conflict until he returned with the completion of their Western Alliance. What would result would be known as the Battle of Tippecanoe. General William Henry Harrison, along with 1,000 men, would advance to within a half-mile of the camp. That evening, November 7th, 1811, the prophet, ignoring his brother's entreaties, tells everybody that he's had a vision and that they will kill Harrison in his sleep. They sneak into the camp that night, break into the wrong tent, kill the wrong guy. The alarm is sounded and the surprise attack is repelled. They will attack the Indian settlement, completely torching it. And in so doing, that is going to end Tecumseh's attempt to form an alliance with all the Western Indian tribes. His power is somewhat broken. He will flee to Canada in hopes of British support.
"15 years later, the celebrated Shawnee war chief Tecumseh and his brother, known as the Prophet, tried to organize a grand alliance of Indian nations throughout the Ohio River Valley to fight westward migration. But at the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811, General William Henry Harrison led a group of militia who destroyed any chance of Tecumseh's Confederation succeeding. Impressed by Tecumseh's oratory, the part-white William Weatherford, known as Red Eagle, led his Creek warriors against Fort Mims on the lower Alabama River in August 1813. The fort's small group of militia fought until all were killed, and the Creeks massacred all but about 36 out of the 500 settlers who had taken refuge in the fort. In 1814, General Andrew Jackson smashed Southern Indian resistance to white settlers at the Battle of the Horseshoe Bend in Alabama.
Total victory over these Indians, of course, opens the West for settlement. William Henry Harrison and Andrew Jackson both will parlay their victories into the presidency. And we'll touch upon that later. But these Indian wars
15 years.
prove to Americans that the Indians are being inspired by the British. The back of the Indian Rebellion is broken, but the war hawks are going to seize upon this to say, see, we told you that it is the British that are inspiring and arming the Indians. So the cry simply became, on to Canada, on to Canada. Not just because it would remove the British from the continent, but because, once again, more land. So, major reasons for the war, in no particular order: the incitement of the Indians by the British, impressment of American sailors, some 5,000 will be taken, the blockade of American ports, pushing us into economic servitude, and of course, the economic servitude, which I just mentioned, now getting worse than ever. A total failure to respond to American needs. This will be settled at the end of the war, but it's going to come up again as another major reason for World War I, the age-old cry for freedom of the seas. Finally, June 1st, 1812, Madison sends a declaration of war to Congress. The House votes for war 79 to 49. Ironically, one of the representatives from Virginia, a guy by the name of Richard Bent, is going to be kept drunk the entire day. People who were opposed to the war kind of kidnap him. He's in an alcoholic stupor and cannot vote in favor of the war. Be that as it may, the Senate then approves the revolution 19 to 13. So as you see, the resolution for war barely passes. This will be a nation divided as we go into war. Most of the Northeast, particularly New England, is opposed to the war. And of course, they are mostly Federalist, obviously minority party. They had always been pro-British to a certain degree, but now with their economic lives hinging on it, they become much like some of the southern states who during our pandemic put economic well-being over the overall well-being of the population and the country at large. So, war has been declared. It is a war that is based upon false hopes. This was the scorecard, the way the Americans looked at it. We have a population of 7 million. Canada, total population, is 500,000. We have 7,000 regular troops. There are 8,500 in Canada. We have a total of 16 naval vessels. Great Britain had 97 in the general area. Our military was in a bad state, thanks to Thomas Jefferson and his cutting back, and we've talked about that. We were hoping, of course, with Britain at war with France, that she would be totally distracted. Thomas Jefferson, the ex-president, thinks that this war is going to be easy. It's just a matter of marching into Canada. Those were the beliefs. As a matter of fact, one of our richest individuals, a man by the name of John Jacob Astor, who made his fortune in Pacific Northwest furs, was financing Canada's government and military operations. An American was doing this, again, looking out for his own economic well-being. This, particularly by New Englanders, was going to be known as Mr. Madison's War.
A war was forced upon him, but it was a terribly conducted war, not just by the president, but by the military. And it does nothing for Madison's reputation.
When Madison sent American troops into combat against British troops during the War of 1812, he faced fierce opposition from many in Congress who derided what they called Mr. Madison's War. With some states refusing to cooperate, it became a question of national leadership. Was the federal government strong enough to lead the nation in wartime?
To have shrunk from war would have acknowledged that the American people were not an independent people, but colonists and vassals.
On August 17, 1814, 50 British vessels carrying 4,000 troops anchored just 35 miles from the city of Washington. 5 days later, President Madison warned his wife Dolly to make preparations to flee.
You should be ready at a moment's warning to leave Washington, as it might happen that they would reach the city with the intention to destroy it.
Most Americans have forgotten that during
When Madison ran for election in 1808, take a look at what he was called by the Federalists: a pygmy, an anchovy, and a tortoise who lacked amorous passion. Little Jamie, or Jemmy, as he was sometimes called, was only about 5'3", 5'4", dwarfed really by his wife Dolly. And in this war, Dolly is going to become a hero. She was a widower from Philadelphia who, irony of ironies, would be introduced to Madison by Aaron Burr. And Dolly is going to come out of this war, as I said, a hero to both men and women. And we'll explain why in a minute. Now, why was Madison worried about the dangers of Washington, D.C. being burned to the ground? Well, because we had done the very same thing to the capital of Canada, which at that time was known as York, today Toronto. We had invaded Canada from 3 different directions. All of them turned out to be disastrous, ill-planned, and basically, in many instances, poorly led. But in response, as we left their capital, we burned it to the ground. Well, this was a total insult, and one that was going to be repaid many times over. So, early on, that 3-pronged attack on Canada was going to be disastrous. They have a gentleman by the name of Brock, and their general, as opposed to our General Mudd and Confusion, was Wilson. Unfortunately for the Canadians, at one of the battles, Queenstown Heights, he is going to be killed, thus depriving the Canadians of their best leader. And a leader, by the way, who had made a pact, as you see in the lower left-hand corner, with Tecumseh. One of the ironies of the war is that the American Navy, the smallest 16 ships in the world, acquitted itself rather well. Matter of fact, it got to the point where the British forbade combat one-on-one, because basically, whenever that happened, almost all the time, the American ship won. Better led, better equipped, and just better ships. So if it wasn't 2 or 3 on 1, then they were to avoid combat at all costs. One of the greatest victories would be the battle on the Great Lakes, particularly Lake Erie. As the commanding general or admiral on that particular battle stated, "We have met the enemy and they are ours." So it stopped an invasion from Canada into the United States. But Once the war with Napoleon was over, now untold troops, generals, all veterans and victorious ones at that, would now come to America. And in so doing, which made Washington, D.C. 4,000 British troops put ashore by Admiral Cochrane, who had a particular grudge to bear since his brother had been killed in the American Revolution by the Americans. But D.C. was not their main target. And actually, Dolly Madison would be the last woman, or the last person, I should say, to leave the Capitol, taking with her the copy of Washington's unfinished painting and the original copies of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Her husband had left long before this, and much was made of that by the Federalists, as you can imagine. The British will sit down to dinner in the White House, a dinner that had been prepared for Madison and his cabinet, but when they left in a hurry, everything was left on the table. So toasts were drank by the British, and then they set the executive mansion on fire. And of course, made of stone, it did not burn to the ground. So later on, when they whitewashed over the charred stone, it secured a new name, and that, of course, is what we use today. It's no longer called the Executive Mansion, as it is called the White House. What they were after was, of course, Baltimore. But just a side note, Washington would be spared because of a very unusual weather event. A hurricane would hit D.C., put the fires out, and prevented the British from setting more. They left, and then on to Baltimore they went. If any of you have been to Baltimore Harbor, perhaps you may have been to Fort McHenry. Yeah, right. Fort McHenry was successfully defended, along with a defense outside of Baltimore by largely African-American troops. One of the telling things that happens when Madison goes to view the troops on land, protecting Baltimore on the landward side, he sees all of the black troops, and he looks at the commander and he says, "Won't they run?" Well, of course, that is the opinion of a slave holder. So you can see the racism that was already deeply embedded into the American psyche, and in this case, into the American president. Remember, Washington, Jefferson, and Madison, all from Virginia and all slaveholders. In the meantime, the attack on Fort McHenry, the rockets' red glare, bombs bursting in air, et cetera, okay, would be witnessed by a lawyer named Francis Scott Key. Key was there to negotiate the release of a doctor friend of his that had been taken as a hostage. Could not get off the ship once the bombardment started. 200-pound cannonballs and rockets by the thousands would be hurled at Fort McHenry, killing no one. No one. All the lights in Baltimore have been doused, all the candles and fires doused, so they would not give the British a target to the interior of the city. So when he wrote the Star-Spangled Banner, which was a poem, it would be later set to a British pub drinking song, the very song you know today. That's why he said, "By the rocket's red glare and bombs bursting in air, gave proof to the night that our flag was still there." And what about that flag? That flag, of course, 400 yards of cloth.
In 1812, Madison.
Take a look at this little song sung by two Canadians. Listen closely.
In 1812, Madison was mad. He was the president, you know. Well, he thought he'd tell the British where they ought to go. He thought he'd invade Canada. He thought that he was tough. Instead, we went to Washington and burned down all his stuff in the White House. Burn, 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 and we're the ones that did it. It burned, 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 while the president ran and cried. It burned, 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 and things were very historical. And the Americans ran and cried like a bunch of little babies. Wah, 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 in the War of 1812.
Us hillbillies from Kentucky, dressed in green and red, left home to fight in Canada, but they returned home dead. It's the only war the Yankees lost except for Vietnam.
And also the Alamo.
Right, and the Bay of Ham. The loser was America, the winner was ourselves.
So join right in and gloat about
the War of 1812 in the White House. Burn, 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 and we're the ones that did it. It burned, 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 while the president ran and cried. It burned, 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 and things were very historical. And the Americans ran and cried like a bunch of little babies. Wah, 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 in the War of 1812.
Yes, the War of 1812. You see there at the bottom of the screen, Mary Pickersgill and her 13-year-old daughter, Anne Grace Wisher, a free black, sewed the flags from 400 yards of material. That flag was put up at the end of the bombardment. The idea being the British can't possibly miss this symbol. And so the British would sail away. They would go back down the Chesapeake. They would pull into this small fishing village of St. Michael's, which today, of course, is a very famous tourist destination on the eastern shore of Maryland. They were going to bomb the heck out of Fort Michaels, or St. Michael's, but the residents there were very smart. This took place at night. So what they did was they hung lanterns in trees on the outside or the outskirts of St. Michael's, giving the British a target which was nowhere near the town, thus saving them from much of the devastation that took place during the bombardment. Now, by this time, the Tsar of Russia had offered to mediate an end to the war, to bring the two sides together. So pressure was being put on the British. And by the same token, Napoleon was back. And that is going to lead to, of course, another battle, which the British eventually will win. But by this time, the British were willing to negotiate. What they wanted the United States to do was to give up all of Maine to Canada, and they wanted the entire Midwest to become an Indian state. And if all this happened, since the British were now controlling Florida and Canada, and then, of course, then the Indians in the Midwest, they would surround the new American nation. Well, of course, we were not going to agree to that. In the meantime, Andrew Jackson had defeated the Indians, the Creek Rebellion, or the Red Stick Rebellion, as it was called, in Mississippi, and received orders to take his band of Tennessee volunteers and few regulars to New Orleans. Jackson would put an army together of some 5,000. Many were free blacks, Cherokee Indians, and pirates led by Jean Lafitte. Jackson promises that any other slaves that fight will be given their freedom, and he promises the Indians he will never forget, promises that he'll break on every level. The British will have over 10,000 men, led by, again, veterans of the Napoleonic War. They will find that their attack is no match for the American long rifles. And when the attack on New Orleans is over, there will be 2,000 British casualties and 78 Americans. And actually, all of this took place after the treaty was signed. Now, when the British attack, and this is right outside of New Orleans, they're basically going to march straight across open ground to the Americans, which Jackson has ensconced behind cotton bales and mud. So when the British fires their cannon, they are embedded in cotton and mud and cause little, if any, damage. But they have an open field of view for the British walking straight across. In the meantime, on the other side of that Mississippi River, the British conduct a successful attack, which if they had followed up with, would have allowed them to outflank the Americans, but of course, they did not. Song goes, in 1814, we took a little trip along with Colonel Jackson down the mighty Mississippi, took a little bacon and we took a little beans and fought the bloody British in a town called New Orleans. This is going to promote Andrew Jackson as a world-class hero, at least as far as the Americans are concerned. But what did it say? Well, for the Americans, this was a victory of individualist, charismatic leadership, the citizen soldier beating professionals. Well, really, was it? Well, nothing could have been further from the truth. Or again, before this had taken place, December 24th, Christmas Eve, the treaty had been signed, led by the negotiator, John Quincy Adams, son, of course, of John Adams. February 14th, the treaty is ratified. And in effect, the war ends in a draw. Not 1 inch of territory is lost nor gained. However, something else does change, the result of an accident. Something known as the Hartford Convention. The Federalists, in early 1814, hold a meeting in Hartford, Connecticut, which will result in the death of the Federalist Party. They consider leaving the Union, seceding from the Union, if this war continues. Now, do they ever agree to it? No. And right after it is the victory of Jackson at New Orleans, which, of course, when you take it in juxtaposition to the Hartford Convention, makes them, the Federalists, look like fools and un-American. So all of America rejoices in Jackson's great victory, and the Federalist Party will slink away in total embarrassment. Ironically, it is New England which will react at the start of the Civil War to the South trying to leave the Union. So it was the other way around at one point in time. So, results of the War of 1812, the growth of American nationalism. Ironically, if you take a look here along the map, you see the British naval blockade for 2 years. But the irony is that that blockade forced Americans to become self-sufficient and help give rise to American industrialization. At the same time, with some of the battles, such as the battle on the Navy's battle in Lake Erie, Jackson's victory at New Orleans, and some others, including the death of Tecumseh at the hands of the men of William Henry Harrison at the Battle of the Thames in Canada, there is a great deal of pride in this new American nation. The strengthening of isolationism. We do not want to be involved in the affairs of others. Now, with the British threat and the Indian removal, westward expansion can consider unmitigated. And of course, the disappearance of the Federalist Party. It becomes, for all intents and purposes, a one-party country. And of course, ultimately, the rise of Andrew Jackson. And it will vault him in within 10 years to the presidency. But we will finish in the red. The country is totally bankrupt. And how we deal with that is something that we'll talk about later. So, where did our future lie? Were we truly an individualistic country, as exemplified by the frontiers marksmen that defeated the British on the plains outside of New Orleans? Or was it because we had better artillery, better guns? Was it our industrial technology, which gave us new values?
James Madison was the fourth person to hold the office of President of the United States. Madison, like two earlier presidents, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, was the owner of a large slave plantation in Virginia. Madison's plantation, called Montpelier, was his home, and it is where he now lies buried. James Madison devoted most of his life helping to shape a national government for the United States. During the War for Independence, Madison served here in Philadelphia as a delegate to the Continental Congress, the country's earliest attempt at a unified government. And when the Constitutional Convention was held here in 1787, he represented the state of Virginia in framing a constitution for the United States. In fact, it is because of his enormous contributions to this great document that James Madison is often remembered as the father of the Constitution. Under Thomas Jefferson, Madison served as the Secretary of State. Before that, during the presidency of George Washington, Madison served in the House of Representatives and was largely responsible for drafting the Bill of Rights, the constitutional amendments that guarantee Americans their most basic freedoms. It is ironic to note that only 6 months before he began to work on the U.S. Constitution, Madison placed this ad in the Virginia Gazette, offering a reward of $20 for the capture of one of his slaves who had run away. In 1808, the year James Madison was elected president, the importation of slaves was banned in the United States. Under this law, slaves already in the country remained their master's property, but no new slaves could be imported. However, this law was unpopular in the South and was not enforced. Consequently, large numbers of Africans continued to be shipped to southern ports, where they were sold at public slave auctions, such as the one advertised here. When James Madison took over as president in 1809, the United States was in the grip of a 2-year economic downturn created by self-imposed restrictions on trade that forbade American ships from sailing to foreign ports. These restrictions were contained in the Embargo Act of 1807, a law that was intended to punish foreign nations, especially France and Great Britain, for not respecting America's shipping rights by searching U.S. ships, seizing cargo, and forcing American sailors to work for them against their will. This graph, depicting changes in U.S. exports from 1805 to 1812, clearly shows what happened as a result of U.S. trade restrictions. In 1806, American exports were $110 million. But after the passage of the Embargo Act in 1807, exports fell dramatically to only $20 million. Illegal smuggling in 1808 caused exports to increase to about $50 million, but this was still less than half the level of 2 years before. Right after taking office, President Madison acted to loosen the restrictions on trade, restrictions that had caused American ships to sit idle and U.S. goods to pile up in warehouses. So, still hoping to force France and Britain into ending their interference, a new law was enacted that permitted American ships to trade with all foreign nations except for these two. Unfortunately, the new law, called the Non-Intercourse Act, was no more successful at halting British and French interference with American shipping than the Embargo Act had been. Not only that, under the new law, U.S. exports failed to increase, and the nation's economy continued to suffer. In the year 1810, even though the United States was struggling financially, the government decided to embark on the nation's first big public improvement project. This project was the National Road.
We'll talk more about that later. James Madison, a two-term president, was not a great wartime president. Being the consigliere for a wartime effort was not in his DNA. He will forever be remembered, as, of course, as the father of the Constitution, as you just heard, but his time as president was spotted at best. When he leaves the presidency, he will leave a nation that had started to heal. But he's going to make a decision at the end of that presidency, which pushed the United States closer to disunion. So, the War of 1812, the rise of nationalism, the rise of industry, and the rise of Andrew Jackson.